Okay, so welcome. We are continuing our discussion by looking further into Hobbes. Uh, what I want to do in this discussion is think about how Hobbes thinks about human equality. This is important in our understanding of early modern philosophy because of what it's coming after. So, you might know that Aristotle and the followers of Aristotle uh, had certain approaches for thinking about human nature and as well uh, how certain facts about human nature lead to implications about how we should structure society. So, in the most famous and most aggressive version of the Aristotelian picture, we can look to Aristotle's book, The Politics. Right? And in Aristotle's Politics, he suggests that there are some people in society who are naturally fit to rule, and there are others who are naturally fit to be ruled. So he thinks that people with a great deal of reason should be rulers, whereas people without reason but with strong bodies should be workers. Aristotle goes so far to call people without rationality and with bodies meant for work, he calls these people natural slaves, of all things. He also makes similar claims, Aristotle, about women. So he suggests, for instance, that men are meant to rule, and in the household, women are meant to be ruled. They are not naturally meant to be the head of the household. And we already have looked at two figures in this course that challenge that idea. One of those figures being Marie de Gournay, and the other one being Francois Poulain de la Barre. So they tried to find arguments for human equality. So de Gournay looked at scripture and other classic philosophical texts. So for instance, she leans pretty heavily on figures like Plato and Marcus Aurelius, as well as scripture. And on the other hand, Poulain makes a Cartesian argument for equality between men and women. So Poulain's argument says, look, the mind and the body are separate things. The minds of men and the minds of women have fundamentally the same nature, and sex differentiation should be thought of as a mainly bodily phenomenon. So we got some pretty interesting arguments on the table already about human equality. We should also notice that Hobbes will have some arguments for us to consider as well. So that's what we're going to do in this video. And we're going to be looking at some of Hobbes's classic writings. This particular chunk of Leviathan that I'm going to be looking at is the most famous chunk of this famous book. But we will tune our discussion with a special eye to the question of human equality. So yeah, we will look at the concepts of the state of nature and the laws of nature, but we also want to know the answer to this question. In what sense are human beings, in what sense are people equals of one another? Why should we think it within Hobbes's view? You might remember that Hobbes is a materialist about the mind. I discussed that in a previous video. So Hobbes could not necessarily use the idea that mind and body are utterly separate, right? He's going to say that what your mind is fundamentally a behavior of your body. So he would not be able to use Poulain's argument, for instance, that the mind is not a physical being with a sex. But here's like the first most famous and maybe like the beginner's idea that we get from Hobbes about human equality. And that idea is that people are naturally equal. So Hobbes says that people in their inherent natures are about equal, both in terms of their strength and in terms of their facility of mind. Now, he gives a rather peculiar argument for these claims. His idea that people are equal in strength is that even the weakest have the ability to kill the strongest. So, for instance, we could imagine that even though some are taller than others or some have bigger muscles than others, it's not like anybody is safe from anybody. So he suggests, and this is my example, of course, but even Danny DeVito or somebody with less muscle mass or less bodily size than DeVito could still, through a certain amount of cunning, could kill John Cena, right? So there may be some differences, but in terms of differences that matter, there aren't many. He also says that people are all about equal in their minds. So he says that people will hardly believe that there be so many wise as themselves. So he's going to say, like, look, everybody's contented with how smart they are. And if you ask around, you will probably find that people, too many of them, will believe that they are smarter than average. Logically, that just can't be possible if we have an even distribution of smartness, right? But Hobbes says, look, people are all on about a par with one another, intelligence-wise. He says there's not ordinarily a greater sign of equal distribution of anything that every man is contented with his share. We could state that gender neutrally as well. So every person is contented with their share of intelligence, and they think that their smartness is probably ahead of the curve. That's actually a pretty good sign that we are all about on a par with one another, Hobbes seems to suggest. Now, this gets us to a big important idea from Hobbes. This is going to develop what's problematic about what Hobbes calls the state of war or the state of nature. Because what happens when we're dealing with equals? He says when goods are scarce, equals in ability will become enemies, right? So if there is only, let's say, one bag of Fritos left at the grocery store, and I want a bag of Fritos and you want a bag of Fritos, well, that means that, equals in ability, we could both perhaps reach for that bag and put it in our shopping carts. Equals in ability will become enemies when we have formidable opponents or equal opponents competing for scarce goods. And if you come to get that bag of Fritos, then you're going to be paranoid, right? You're going to be at risk of theft. And if you get into the business of being a thief, well, the potential thieves are going to be at risk of injury also. And this leads us into a situation where we are all in competition with one another. Hobbes says not only are we in competition with one another because of scarce goods, but we are also competing to feel safe from one another, and we are also competing for honor. So he says sometimes people will get in fights because of an insult, that might even just, come out of like a missed hello, right? But Hobbes is having us imagine a situation where we are all equals with one another and there is no government, right? Here's what Hobbes says. He says, during the time that men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man. So we're all equals. We are all trying to defend ourselves and our goods. And in this situation where we're all fighting all the time, he's going to say men will live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. So you've only got yourself to depend on when you are in a state of war. And in such a condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. He also says there wouldn't be anything like culture or navigation or use of commodities, arts, letters, and society. Like we couldn't sit down and learn philosophy together if we were constantly in fear of either of basically being killed by others and having all our goods stolen. he says, in this state of war, you are in continual fear and danger of violent death. And so in the state of war, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If you ever heard that phrase, nasty, brutish, and short, this is where it comes from. So what is Hobbes saying here? He's saying that when there is no government, right? When there is no person enforcing rules, we are all going to be in a state of fear, and we are all going to be, quite reasonably, Hobbes thinks, playing defense, right? So we're going to have our fists up, and the fact that we have our fists up is going to cause other people to put their fists up. So this is a situation where there is no government and where people have to live their lives in fear. Hobbes calls it the state of war. He does not actually use the phrase state of nature in the Leviathan. That's terminology that emerges later in other writers like Locke and Rousseau. But Hobbes is getting at the same idea by talking about being in perpetual war and having a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. So what is the state of nature? It's a state where there is no law and no enforcer. Now, Hobbes was very concerned about it because at the time that the Leviathan was being written, England was in the midst of a civil war. There was basically no agreement about who was the king. And as a result, we had battling factions. And when we had these battling factions, all people had to rely on is the security that their own strength and invention could leave them with. And Hobbes says this sort of state of war is an inherently bad thing. So why worry about the state of nature? Well, Hobbes points out, even when there are laws, so even in our society, which does have a government, we still lock our doors, we still arm ourselves if we think that there might be bad people around. And Hobbes is going to say that is just turned up even worse in a situation where there are no laws. He's going to point out that in the state of nature, if there is no government, everything is legal. And the way that he puts it is that nothing is just or unjust. So we might think that if there is nothing just or unjust, he's going to say that treachery, theft, violence are actually going to be virtues of self-protection rather than bad things to do. So Hobbes points out that in the state of nature, there is no such thing as property. Everything's legal. Nothing is unjust. Sometimes Hobbes uses the term having the right to all things. And what he basically means there is there is nothing stopping you from doing anything. So when there is no government, there are no rules. And when there are no rules, you have the right to do anything you want. And this is an interesting picture already because Hobbes doesn't think that maximum total freedom is a good thing. He actually thinks that maximum total freedom for everybody could actually be more of what would look like, a dystopian hellscape. But Hobbes says the good thing for human beings is that we can escape this dystopian hellscape, which is the state of nature. So Hobbes is not pro-state of nature. In fact, he's going to say that because we don't want to live lives that are nasty, brutish, poor, and short, we should escape it. And the way that we escape the state of nature, Hobbes says, is through the use of reason. So here's how he puts it. He's going to say that a law of nature is a general rule that you find by reason, and these are rules that forbid a person to do that which is destructive of your own life, or that takes away your means of preserving it. So the idea here is going to be, you are, to a large extent, a rational animal, and you can recognize that doing certain things is going to be destructive of your own life. So, for instance, you would realize that driving the wrong way down the highway at a high speed is likely to kill you. right? So that could be a law of nature. It could be a rule: don't drive the wrong way down the highway at a high speed, because that would destroy your life or take away your means of preserving it. Right? And we each have the liberty at the start to use our reason to preserve our own life. So, we are at liberty to protect ourselves. Now, here are the first two laws of nature that Hobbes gives us. He's going to say that the first law of nature is every man ought to endeavor to seek peace, peace being the opposite of this state of war, right? But he also says, if you cannot attain peace, you may seek the advantages of war. Now, what he's saying here is, if you are kind, cooperative, and trusting in the state of nature, well, that's actually a great way for others to ransack you, take your goods, and kill you, right? So in fact, if others are attacking you, you should not be cooperative. You should actually do whatever you can to protect your own life, right? But we want to get out of that situation, so we try to find peace with others, and then it's only in exceptional cases. And in these exceptional cases, then you defend yourself by all means necessary if people are trying to steal from you or kill you. And here's the second law of nature that Hobbes gives us. He says, be willing when others are, for peace and self-defense, to lay down your right to all things. So remember I said having the right to all things is having nothing be illegal. You might think about this as like a permanent version of what's going on in that movie, The Purge, right? Where everything is legal for a bit. Well, Hobbes is basically saying what you need to do is be willing when others are willing to lay down your right to all things. So you're going to say, look, I will take a little less freedom. I will constrain myself and promise not to do certain things, largely not to kill, not to steal from those around me. And, if I do that when others are willing to do the same thing, that's actually going to protect us. That's going to allow us to seek peace instead of having to all be in a state of self-defense and mutual hostility, right? So this is Hobbes' idea of laying down a right. I agree not to steal from you when you agree not to steal from me. So we could also think of that as a transfer of rights. So I'm going to give up my right to take whatever I want if you also give up your right to take whatever you want. And this is how the concepts of justice and injustice emerge for Hobbes. So to do an injustice for Hobbes is to sort of contradict yourself. It would be to promise not to do something and then do it anyways. So within this view, we get the concepts of justice and injustice from a mutual contract between different people trying to live together. Now, another step, we can think about contracts. So if I agree to lay down a right and you agree to lay down a right, then we could think of that as a contract, right? It is a mutual transfer of rights between two parties. That works all well enough, especially if it's a straight swap of goods, right? So if I just decide to give my coffee cup to you, whereas you are going to give me, I don't know, a basket that you weaved. So we could just transfer the right of exclusive control for the one thing over the other thing. But other contracts are more complex, right? So sometimes you have a contract where the work done is spread out over time. And the work spread out over time might be something like this. I could make a contract with you to bring you a basket of tomatoes on Friday, and then you could then in turn promise to bring me a basket of apples on Monday. But Hobbes notices something here. If I bring you the tomatoes, you could just enjoy the literal fruits of my labor and get away with not picking apples and bringing those back to me, right? So the problem that Hobbes is noticing here is that contracts, and especially covenants, are liable to cheating, right? Because you will have little incentive to perform your service after I've given you payment. And the way that Hobbes is thinking about it, he says that the fear of non-performance on the part of others invalidates the covenant. So he's going to say, for instance, that we can't get a contract going off the ground if I'm not going to trust you to bring me that basket of apples after I give you the basket of tomatoes. Right? So Hobbes points out that in order to make covenants work, there needs to be some coercive power to compel men equally to the performance of their covenants, greater than the benefit they expect by the breach of their covenant. So think about how much it's worth to you to not bring me the apples and to not do the labor involved with fulfilling your part of the contract. Well, Hobbes is going to argue that if there were a disincentive structure against breaking that part of the contract, so here's where we bring in the Leviathan or the enforcer or the sovereign, we might say. You know, if you have a big man who can offer some punishments, so, you know, a stick, as it were, well, if you realize that breaking your covenant brings you too much risk of being punished by the outside enforcer, so this is what Hobbes is talking about when he talks about the coercive power, right? The coercive power is saying, keep your covenants or else, right? So coercion is basically just telling somebody, if you do this one thing, I'm going to give you an extra consequence, right? So Hobbes says what we need is to have an enforcer of our contracts and covenants. So that's the third law of nature that Hobbes gives us, that if you perform a covenant, or if you enter into a covenant, you have to carry out your part of the deal. And it also means that in order to make covenants, we need an enforcer with an incentive structure that gives us enough trust that each party is going to do their job in recognition of the fact that there is that coercive power compelling us to stay true to our word. So here we get the third law of nature. You are going to keep peace by carrying out the covenants that you make. And again, Hobbes says this is where justice and injustice come from. Justice is keeping your covenants. Injustice is non-performance. Now, oftentimes, this is the end of the discussion of Hobbes and the laws of nature. But we should notice that in the next chapter of Hobbes's Leviathan, he will also, so actually through chapter 15, he gives us more laws of nature, right? And here's an important law of nature that emerges later in the chapter. And this really comes back to the question of human equality. So this is why I want to flag this particular law of nature. I think that Hobbes has about 20 laws of nature in all, maybe 19. But here's what Hobbes says. Let's think about this passage together, because I think that this deepens our understanding of our big question for today, which is, what is Hobbes's view of human equality? Here's what he tells us. He says, I know that Aristotle, in his first book of his Politics, for a foundation of his theory of government, maketh men by nature some more worthy of command, whereas others are worthy of being commanded. But Hobbes says, this view of Aristotle's is not only against reason, So he thinks that the natural equality of people has been established earlier, but it's also against experience. He points out that there are very few so foolish that had not rather govern themselves than be governed by others. So people want to be in control of their own lives. That seems like a good point. So we might disagree with Aristotle's view that subordinate people, and Aristotle does shockingly claim this, that people in subordinate roles will be happy to be subordinate. So he says, if nature therefore have made men equal, that equality is to be acknowledged. So if it is true that people are fundamentally of the same nature, then we should just say, look, there is no natural hierarchy of human beings. But he says, if nature have made men unequal, so maybe there are differences in the nature of people from person to person. But he then says, yet, because men think themselves equal, will not enter into conditions of peace, but upon equal terms. So here's what Hobbes is saying here. He's going to say, look, even if there are important differences from person to person, you're not going to get a peaceful society unless we begin with the premise that people, how does he put it? We have to enter into society, into a state of peace on equal terms. He says we need to admit such equality. And therefore, for the ninth law of nature, I put this, that every man acknowledge another for his equal by nature. The breach of this precept, he says, is called pride. So in order to live peacefully with others, we need to at least proceed on the assumption, not express a contempt for others, of seeing them as less than. Right? So here's my paraphrase. Nature makes us equal. Hobbes actually thinks that. But even if we weren't, reason tells us that we should at least treat others as if they are our equals, lest we fall into a state of war. Now, here's the big takeaway. Hobbes gives us an argument in favor of treating human beings as equal and to reject the Aristotelian picture of natural hierarchy between human beings. But the argumentative strategy is peculiar, to say the least. One thing that he's going to say is we are equal because we are all equally at threat of being killed by one another. That seems strange, because that usually isn't what people are talking about when they talk about equality. The other argument seems to be what we might call a pragmatic argument for human equality. That we should move forward on the assumption that people are equal, maybe not because it's been proven by the evidence. And he says, maybe he does think that the evidence proves it. So maybe I should say it this way. He says, whether or not we have proved that people are the equals of one another, it would be practical to proceed on this assumption. So we might say that the reasons for believing that people are equal could be practical. That what we are doing is engaging in a certain strategic move to preserve our own lives and to stay out of war. So even if you can't fully believe it, there are good practical reasons to acknowledge others as your equals by nature. So I will leave it to you to weigh the benefits and drawbacks of this approach. Do we need firm evidence and rock-solid arguments, maybe like the ones that we got from Poulin? Or should we be a little less metaphysical, we might say, and a little bit more practical by thinking about the costs of denying the equality of human beings? And with that, I will thank you for listening, and I will look forward to hearing maybe what some of your thoughts on this question are. So as always, take care.